Hey, Flapjack, why don't you wait your turn before I bounce your face off a dumpster?
It's beautiful.
Walking simulator, a game where all you do is walk. It's a term that has come to brand a difficult-to-define genre of games that has sprung up in the last few years. Now, obviously, this is not literally all that you do in these types of games. The term is sarcastic in the way it makes fun of the lack of shooting or puzzle solving in a first-person perspective, genre mainstays that have become expected in a game like this. What's most puzzling to me, though, isn't just the jokingly derogatory title, but the ferocity and dominance of the criticism leveled against these types of games. Because it's not just regular criticism that defines the genre, but an outright refusal to even qualify them as games through a fundamental teardown of their very right to exist. The reason for all this ire seems to be its borrowing of the first-person perspective to create a game that shuns all conventions and expectations that one might expect from a game in this perspective. Walking simulators don't feature guns, or swords, or any real combat at all, and what defines them more than anything is their passion to tell a narrative with as little interactive elements as possible. Minimalism is not something that generally goes over well with the gaming public, who are being conditioned more and more to expect bigger games with more and more content, expecting to pay $60 and receive a game that they can play for 20 hours, 30 hours, even hundreds of hours. A game that you play for about 3 to 4 hours just does not fit into what most players are looking for in this day and age. But for my money, minimalism is exactly what the game industry sorely needs, with games becoming more and more bloated by the year. Sometimes, a game that I can beat in a few hours and experience a complete beginning, middle, and end is exactly what I am looking for, and a game that doesn't require a ton of thought or motor skills from me for completion can be an incredibly refreshing, valuable thing. I love complicated system-driven games, but occasionally, something short and simple is exactly the kind of game that I am in the mood for. Walking simulators provide that for me, at least some of them. It's a genre that's harder to pull off well more than a conventional first-person action title, because it has to do more with less. The games we're going to look at today do that in varying degrees and in varying formats. The game largely credited for popularizing this whole genre and the requisite backlash associated with it is Gone Home, released by the Fulbright Company. The team responsible for this game is the same team who developed the masterpiece of a DLC for BioShock 2 Minerva's Den. And you can really see the lineage because the story is told very much like a shot game, non-linearly, through the environment and through notes scattered around its semi-open world design. The most remarkable thing about Gone Home is how it positions itself in a genre that expects action, fantasy, excitement, while during the duration of the game, it progressively dismantles every one of those expectations, bringing it more and more down to earth. Because games are by default more wild and crazy than any other medium, it's actually shocking the more toned down and realistic a game is instead of less. You play as a college student returning home from a big trip abroad to an empty house and a mysterious note left on the front door by your sister. It's the perfect setup for a spooky haunted house mystery, a big empty house laden with secrets as an ominous thunderstorm sets the mood. But that's not this story. There are no hostilities in Gone Home, and the secrets to uncover are not eldritch truths not meant for mortal eyes, but relatable, everyday uncomfortable problems. On the surface, this looks like an idealistic picture of a healthy family life, a big house with a happy family portrait that dawns the center of the foyer. But dig under the surface, into the cabinets and drawers and locked rooms, and you'll find a family barely holding together. It's remarkable the way the game plays with conventions, where you spend all this time constructing a combination to a safe or a locker, only to receive some evidence of regular everyday problems or something poignant and human instead of sweet loot or some dark horrible secret. The father is a struggling writer who does trashy JFK conspiracy novels that apparently aren't selling very well according to notes from his publisher. Dig into his study and you'll find an unsureness of how to move forward and even explicit magazines hidden under a stack of his poor-selling sequel. So yes, the time period is pretty important to this story as well. It's 1995, and the game makes that very clear with a cavalcade of pop culture references, like finding a ticket to Pulp Fiction that fell in between the couch seats, Nintendo gaming systems with Street Fighter set up in front of massive tube-style TVs, and why there are so many actual written-down notes in this house instead of emails and text messages. This time period struck a chord with game journalists who reviewed the game around its release, as nearly every review of the game mentions the time period in detail, and how it works on nostalgic impulses. But I'm a bit younger than most professional journalists, so it's harder for me to connect on a personal level to this setting. I was born in '94, so while I do remember cordless phones and grainy tube-style TVs and bad haircuts, it's all a distant memory, discordant and abstract. It doesn't elicit some fuzzy feeling of being a kid again for me, but the attention to detail in recreating this time period is clearly extremely well done. With the father struggling to land another hit, his marriage is suffering too, with his wife clearly becoming infatuated with a coworker in the Forest Service she works at. She never mentions it outright in letters to her friend, but it's clear she knows that something is going on. And peek under the bed and you'll find a lent copy of Leaves of Grass with an affectionate note from this mysterious benefactor. Everywhere you look in this house, you'll find the idealistic family image cracking in some way. Most dramatically with the sister, who is supposed to be watching the house with the parents left for their anniversary celebration, but is nowhere to be seen. The real mystery of the game turns out to be finding out what happened to her in the time that you've been gone. And the answer isn't that she's been kidnapped or trapped in the walls or murdered by some monster or something, but that she's left with her romantic partner Lonnie to make a new life for themselves. Ah, okay, so that's where the time period ties in the strongest. The LGBT community in 2019 has made a ton of progress since 1995. In 1995, it was still largely seen as sexually deviant or edgy to be lesbian, gay, bi, or trans. What Sam is going through in this game is tailor-made to appeal to those discovering their sexuality in a world that does not accept or understand it. But that's not true to my personal experience, and that's why I find it difficult to connect with this aspect of the story, as it significantly hinges on the player to connect on a fundamental emotional and nostalgic level, both in its setting and in its central story. I'm a straight white male living in rural central Florida. My district has voted for healthcare fraud and human lizard hybrid Rick Scott for governor twice, and now for senator too. I work in the pool business, so the people that I interact with on a daily basis are people who unironically wear MAGA and NRA hats out in public. I have been yelled at for saying happy holidays to someone who indignantly demanded that I only acknowledge Christmas as a legitimate holiday. It's safe to say that I have never once experienced any kind of discrimination based on race or sexuality, and I've never had to hide a secret relationship for fear of being outed in my life either. My experience is the polar opposite of Sam in Gone Home, so my ability to connect with this story is based entirely off of an abstract empathy, and I feel like it's just not as resonant as with someone who has actually gone through something like this. However, I'm not going to say this is an objective flaw with the game or some kind of social justice invasion into popular media. I'm not one of those people allergic to anything socially progressive and do appreciate and respect that this game exists and can still enjoy it for its unique elements. I consider it more a personal failing than anything else that I can't absorb this game's full potential. Just to put my biases out in front, honestly, if I had known this is what the story is about before I bought it, I probably never would have. But I'm glad that I did. It's not my favorite video game story, but the way in which it's told is my favorite method of storytelling, even if it's not the most effective or unique. Environmental. Forgive me for the indulgence, but I am planning on doing a BioShock video eventually when I can really get in depth as to why this specific method of storytelling is so effective. Gone Home does it well, and more realistically, your sister explicitly left some of these journal entries for you to find instead of audio logs thrown around seemingly at random like in BioShock. But it doesn't have the complexity due to its much smaller scale. It's a game that I appreciate more than I viscerally enjoy. Its method of storytelling is starkly brilliant and something that needs more coverage in modern games. But the content of the story itself is something that I have difficult gaining interest or curiosity in. It's the actual playing of the game I find the most compelling. Scouring rooms for information on what's going on, uprooting couches and turning on every light in the house purely out of curiosity. It's genuinely an entertaining gameplay experience, and it demonstrates that you don't need hostile enemies or fail states to create an enjoyable video game. Exploration can satisfy itself when done this well. While Gone Home didn't try to give its world any hostilities, Firewatch does the opposite by cultivating a constant mood of paranoia and danger in its vast wilderness setting. Following in Gone Home's shoes, you play as Henry, a regular guy with regular problems. His whole life story basically is detailed in the opening through a choose-your-own-adventure style prologue where you make minor choices about your life prior but ultimately destined to end up where he is now, which is unfortunately an emotional wreck fleeing to the Wyoming wilderness to try and cope with the situation he finds himself in. His wife Julia has developed early onset dementia and slowly corroded every aspect of his life. It destroyed his wife's career, put their plans for kids on hold, took away his freedom and even his basic happiness, as Julia's dementia prevents her from even recognizing him on a consistent basis. He debates putting a chain on her door when he leaves the house, debates sending her to a full-time nursing facility. Seriously heavy emotional problems, but distinctly normal ones that some people unfortunately have to go through. It works, and the reason the prologue is so effective at connecting the player with Henry is that it goes through Henry and Julia's entire relationship from when they met in college to when they move in together and once her illness develops. You get to make choices like choosing which dog to adopt and which pose to strike for a playful drawing. Even though it's just words on a screen, it's powerful and puts Henry and the player in a dark place when he takes a job watching for fires in the Shoshone National Forest. And what a beautiful forest it is. Firewatch is one of the best looking games I have ever played. Not technically, it deliberately uses a stylized art style to hide its fairly low quality textures up close, but its use of lighting and color means that every second of this game looks like a painting. The development team, Campo Santo, recruited Ollie Moss, famous for doing those stylized Star Wars movie posters, as the art director, and his style really shows through. Deep orange burning sunsets and the interaction between light and the trees consistently make playing the game viscerally enjoyable, even if it doesn't have complicated gameplay mechanics. While the art style was received almost universally positively, Firewatch's gameplay received a lot of criticism from regular players. I use the umbrella term walking simulator to describe this difficult to define genre of games, and while that is a little oversimplistic to describe Gone Home and Edith Finch, walking simulator is the most literal and accurate term to describe Firewatch than maybe any other game in this genre. Although maybe hiking simulator just to be persnickety. Your goal as a fire lookout initially is to hike around the forest and do minor jobs like scare off some teenagers with fireworks and repair communication lines, while keeping an eye out for fires. The experience is very similar to hiking in real life by using a map and trail markers to navigate your way throughout the forest. By default, it shows Henry's position on the map, but I think this takes away from the fun of getting lost in the woods, so I recommend turning this off. With it off, it's a genuine navigational challenge, and while there are no explicit fail states, I don't know, Henry getting eaten by a bear if he takes too long to get to an objective or something, it still requires thought and input from the player, which achieves the same result. The challenge in Gone Home is more a challenge of reading comprehension and detective work. The challenge here is of embracing the amorphous wilderness on your own, with only a map and a radio to guide you. Some might decry the lack of survival mechanics like needing to drink and eat, but that to me is one of the largest issues with defining games like this. Would having to stop every 15 minutes and shove water in Henry's face really have added anything to the experience? Would having to open an interface and track different meters all the time really enhance Henry's personal story? Or would they have been shoehorned in just to legitimize Firewatch as a game to fit some cookie-cutter definition? If the tone didn't make it clear, I obviously think it's the latter. There's always going to be a scarce number of elitists who will turn up their nose and say, "A game with no challenge is no game." But even people I respect have put forward the idea that Firewatch is worthless because of its lack of thorough mechanics. It's a painfully narrow view of game design that doesn't consider how fail states can actually muddle and dilute certain styles of games. It's most evident when you look at the story, which is supremely tight and well-paced, a rare thing for video games. They usually disrupt the pace of the story through its gameplay conventions. Here, it is entirely stripped away to put as much emphasis on the nature and on Henry and Delilah instead. What largely saves the nature from becoming overwhelming and tiresome after a while is that it gives Henry a partner to communicate with, a genuinely likable, funny, and believable partner in Delilah, Henry's overseer positioned at an adjacent lookout tower. Delilah is voiced by Cissy Jones and Henry by Rich Sommer, and the two actors have some kind of magic chemistry because their banter is magnetic as the emotional anchor of the story.
He was the latter.
And I'm the former, aren't I?
Well, I didn't want to say anything.
No, it's fine. I'll just chuck my walkie-talkie into the river.
Oh, come on.
And you'll never hear from me again.
Finally, peace and quiet. Woohoo!
So...
Isn't your radio supposed to be in the river?
I couldn't bring myself to do it.
Well, I guess I'm stuck with you then.
Yeah.
On the surface, there's sarcastic, playful banter, but there's a real connection there underneath, as the first line between them demonstrates.
It's Henry, right?
Yeah.
I'm Delilah.
Yeah, that's what the guy said on the phone.
So, what's wrong with you?
Excuse me?
People take this job to get away from something. So what's wrong?
What's wrong with you?
Nobody takes a 3-month job that's a 2-day hike from any other civilization unless they are working through some kind of serious existential problems. Both Henry and Delilah are outcasts in a way, running to the wilderness to escape their very serious real-life problems. The main thrust of the story is paranoia. Very real paranoia when Henry's lookout tower is trashed at the end of the first day. As soon as it happens, the gears in your head start turning because everyone that Henry has interacted with on his innocuous first day, the teens setting off fireworks, the guy with the flashlight, and the other lookouts leaving notes in storage caches are all possible suspects. Where the first day is vibrant and peaceful in its banality, subsequent days are given an air of constantly being watched, feeling eyes on you at all times, burning through the trees. There are some seemingly unexplainably weird things going on. As one mystery is solved, another even weirder one quickly develops. Eventually, Henry and Delilah get the idea that someone is listening to their radio chatter after Henry finds a note detailing some of the things they have said before he is knocked out from behind. But it happens so fast that you can never really be sure if it's just a paranoid delusion by Henry, and that very much seems like a possibility once you see Henry's crazy crackpot conspiracy board up in his tower. The tone descends further and further, Henry and Delilah using code over the radio, eventually swapping out for new ones, and finally, breaking the rules and going into gated-off territory to satisfy their burning curiosity. It reaches a point of complete lunacy once Henry stumbles into what looks like a government-run spy facility with equipment meant for intercepting communications, high-tech tents, and agriculture set up for long-term occupation. There's logs of everything Henry and Delilah have said, even things Delilah has said before Henry showed up at the Shoshone, with personality analysis logs that only someone listening for extended periods could produce. In a brief moment of panic, Delilah suggests burning down the listening station. Henry declines, but as soon as he is leaving, the station has caught fire in the distance, igniting a massive forest fire in the region. It looks like more than ever, Henry's paranoid delusions might be true. Whoever set fire to the station now has proof, on tape, of Delilah's intent to burn down the station. But of course, that's not this story. The answers to all the questions are more rooted in Firewatch's core themes than they are in nebulous government conspiracies or alien invaders. Although the middle portion of the story is about paranoia, that's ultimately an extension of Firewatch's main thematic interest, the wilderness as a refuge for suffering. Early on in the game, Henry finds a backpack loaded with climbing gear with the name Brian Goodwin embroidered on it. Delilah recognizes the name and remembers Brian as a kid who got dragged out to the woods by his dad Ned, who took a fire lookout position for very much the same reason Henry did. He was experiencing PTSD from his time in the military, and then on top of that, his wife died, leaving him a single parent. To cope with the grief, he fled to the Shoshone, taking his kid with him. Delilah thought that they'd left their post halfway through the summer, probably due to Brian being unequipped for the kind of hardcore survival techniques his dad was trying to teach him, but the truth is much worse than that. Brian died, indirectly murdered by his dad, who took him spelunking and rock climbing in a cave when Brian just wanted to stay at camp and draw. It's horribly sad. His mangled corpse lies at the bottom of the cave after his climbing gear broke. Ned's suffering only consumed him further, and it drove him to stay in the Shoshone forever. He's a murderer now. His wife and son are dead. Civilization holds nothing for him. He's become a hermit, indulging in his suffering, and once he ran out of books, decided to intercept the radio chatter for entertainment. All of the things Henry has seen in the game, the recordings of his conversations, the paths of his movement, the attack from behind, it wasn't the government at all. It was just Ned, trapped in his personal hell for 3 years in the Shoshone with nothing else to do. Amazingly, this part of the story is the most talked about thing in Firewatch, with an almost universal consensus of the ending being disappointing. Disappointing. Bad writing, it just turns out to be a dude who is doing all this. Boring! A dark mirror of Henry that reflects what he will turn into if he lets his suffering overwhelm him. A believable, human villain driven to abandoning society to soak in his own misery. Ha! Gay! Bring on the aliens, bruv. Alright, so I'm exaggerating a bit, but I seriously do have trouble understanding those who have gripes with the ending. Ned is a great villain, even though he's never really seen in the game at all. It's because he isn't really malevolent or violent in his current state. He just wants to be left alone, to hide his secret and be forgotten because he doesn't want to face what he has done. Given different circumstances without Delilah, Henry very well may have ended up the same way. Isn't that exactly what he did by taking this job, as a way to escape Julia and not have to cope with the pain her illness causes? The wilderness can be both an escape and a prison for the grieving. The other part of the story that is heavily criticized is Delilah, because you don't ever get to meet her face to face, even when you are tasked with evacuating to her lookout tower at the end of the game. But truly, slow down and ask yourself, the game's writing goes to great lengths to make its characters feel believable and realistic. This engine is not exactly made to make character models look in any way true to life. Would seeing a most likely, janky, poorly animated version of Delilah really do anything other than satisfy a knee-jerk reaction? The scene that we get instead is poetic and satisfying in how low-key it is. Delilah is already gone, but says her goodbyes to Henry, who now communicates from the same tower and with the same headset that Delilah has spent the whole game in. Even though there is some romantic leanings in the middle of the game, it's obvious here that it was never really going to go anywhere. Some people were disappointed that there is no romance options like as a BioWare RPG, but the game treating this relationship so honestly is really refreshing and poignant in a way. The summer is over. Henry still has to go back to Boulder and Delilah back to her own life.
I'll have to figure out what I'm doing every summer from now on that isn't this.
You're not coming back?
No. And you'll have to... I don't know.
Yeah, me neither. I don't know what's next.
Instead, the real final choice of the game is how Henry is going to move on. He's seen firsthand where retreating from civilization and soaking in grief will get him, but he also has to face the awful reality of Julia's condition and how unhappy it has made him. There's an extremely subtle choice about 3/4 of the way through the game once Henry assembles his nutcase conspiracy board, where his wedding ring is just lying on the desk. It's symbolic more than anything because Henry can communicate to Delilah either way at the end, but it's just brilliant in the way it connects the player to Henry. There's not really a clear answer. Going back to Julia could only bring Henry right back to where he started. And leaving her in a nursing home is cruel and callous in a way that only Ned would understand, but will ultimately leave Henry free to pursue his own life. This whole ending is a full-stop rejection of player expectations and genre conventions. It doesn't try to wow players with something even more wild and crazy than what they were expecting, but with the opposite. It does make it divisive, but it makes it so much more unique. What really demonstrates this rejection of player expectations from me, more than anything else, is the camera. When you find Brian Goodwin's backpack, it also has a cheap disposable camera inside it. It's supposed to be used for memorializing your summer in the Shoshone with beauty shots and things to remember it by. However, on the first playthrough, I used it in a completely different way. I thought it would be a hidden mechanic where if you document the unexplainably weird things going on, then Henry would have evidence at the end of the game and maybe affect the ending. What I expected out of Firewatch was a branching narrative in the traditional sense. These are the guys who wrote the first season of The Walking Dead after all. I expected the government conspiracy angle to take hold and maybe end with a shocking twist. But what I got instead was something much more bittersweet and emotionally resonant. Some were underwhelmed that all it was in the end was a camera and not something greater. But what I got in the end is something much more tangible and relatable. A cheap, disposable piece of plastic but loaded up with beauty and meaning and remembrance. It's what makes Firewatch such an effective wilderness story. It downplays its outlandish elements to put the focus on the characters and their relationship with the environment. The Shoshone is a retreat in the literal sense. It's where the grieving, the misanthropes, the outcasts can go to either come out again stronger, more confident, or fall into the hole of their own personal hell even further. It's deeply rooted in how it functions in our modern society and how we connect with it emotionally. Both Gone Home and Firewatch are stories about characters out of sight. Gone Home with notes and diaries, Firewatch with a radio. It's abstract. You never really get a good look at any of the important characters in the story. It's instead all about the things they left behind or their voice being transmitted from miles away. What Remains of Edith Finch changes the formula, most notably by transporting the player directly in control of its little vignettes that constitute the hook of its story. It has some of the most ingenious, compelling, and unique storytelling methods that exist in any video game. Its tone also abandons the low-key realism of Gone Home and Firewatch for something much more heightened and fairy tale-like. Its themes are still very much in tune with the genre, about regular people experiencing regular things, but its presentation is much more grand and exuberant than the 90s simulation of Gone Home or the landscape portrait look of Firewatch. Like Gone Home, it's about a crumbling family and the house they live in. Unlike Gone Home, this is a family that has experienced suffering on a scale unlike any other. Instead of regular hidden problems insidiously creeping into a healthy family life, the Finch family suffers a curse, so the legend goes. The main character, Edith, is heading back to her childhood home after what happens to be a not insignificant time away. The house is this precarious monstrosity with new floors built amateurly on top of one another over and over again. The whole thing has this crude, cobbled together look where new rooms and floors are built without any consideration for structural integrity or orderly appearance. And it's completely empty, as Edith mentions that they all left after the death of Lewis. And Lewis is not the only one in this family to die. Pretty much all of them, one by one, have been falling in unfortunate accidents, which is why the family has come to believe that they suffer a curse. The house sits like a cemetery, with all of their rooms serving as perfectly preserved headstones, summing up all of their unique individual personalities and hobbies. Edith Finch is the first fully interactive memorial that I've ever played. There's nothing to do in this game besides reflect, go through your childhood home, experience the memories of those you knew personally and those who came before you. That's basically the point of the whole game. Most of the Finch members have fully interactive flashback sequences that put the player in control of them right before their death. In Sam's room, you snap pictures of a hunting trip with his daughter before he meets his fate. In Gregory's room, play with toys in a bathtub. In Barbara's room, play through a Tales from the Crypt meets John Carpenter's Halloween comic book sequence. In Lewis's room, experience his relentless daydreaming during his job at the cannery. All of it sounds really mundane on the surface, but the incredible variety, ingenuity, and unique gameplay mechanics are constantly surprising and engaging. Barbara and Lewis's segments are definitely my favorite, and show off some truly genius methods of using first-person interactivity in novel, effective ways. Barbara's segment uses a smorgasbord of 80s homages and references with a comic book called Dreadful Stories. It's got a Crypt Keeper homage and its narrator Old Jack, and it even uses the licensed Halloween theme to really establish its time period. The comic book panels are used both as a storytelling method and as a unique transitional window for short gameplay sequences. The pace of it is so solid. When you do get control, it's only for a brief moment to make action sequences more intense, and still preserve the feeling of reading a comic book. Lewis's sequence has become the game's defining moment and has been written about in way more detail and by way more talented people than me for how brilliantly it uses the first-person perspective to express a feeling that almost everyone has had at some point, daydreaming during a monotonous daily grind at work. While Gone Home's attempts at relating to everyday people never quite hit home for me, forgive the pun, this pervasive boredom and tedium is something I am very familiar with. When I'm not working on videos or going to class, I work at a pool store where I test pool water to balance chemicals. I do probably 30 to 50 a day, most of the time repeat customers whose water, especially during the winter, rarely changes between visits. It can be interesting when I get water that has a unique problem and I get to feel like a detective as I ask questions and look at past tests to see what the problem is, but most of the time, it is just about the most malevolently boring thing that I do in my daily life. Testing somebody's water 5 days in a row with the same readout feels maddeningly pointless. I do anything to get away. This is the way Lewis feels at the cannery, only to a much more extreme degree than myself. Standing at a table by himself doing the exact same motion, presumably for hours at a time. You experience this firsthand by moving the mouse to the left of the screen to grab a fish, and then moving it to the right of the screen to chop its head off, and then forwards to toss it. Over and over and over and over again. As the sequence goes on, the left side of the screen shows Lewis's daydream imagining himself as an adventurer in an Egyptian-style landscape. It would have been so easy to have this completely take over their perspective, but this sequence is as brilliant as it is, because you have to control Lewis's fish prepping duties and his daydreaming adventure at the same time. There is a balance between Lewis's daydream and his real job, as the daydream will slowly expand throughout the course of the segment, but if you start slacking, then the fish will pile up on the left side of the screen, literally impairing and taking over his dream life. It perfectly expresses, in a mechanical way, that same balance between tedious work activity and roaming thought that most of us have had to deal with at some point in our lives. While piecing together notes and interactive radio conversations are effective in their own way, these sequences in Edith Finch demonstrate a masterclass in innovative storytelling. The pacing is the most surprising to me. It would have been so easy, so incredibly easy to base an entire game off of one of these sequences. I can see an interactive comic book game being released on Steam and not even batting an eye at the concept. But the developers were extremely smart and considerate to constantly change up the presentation and gameplay styles, with short, controlled vignettes and brief moments of exploration in the house. Any one of these sequences on their own, and at a greater length, would certainly crumble without any complicated mechanics, but together, strung one after the other mixed with exploration of the house as Edith, they create a freight train of momentum that carries it all the way through its very brief 1.5 to 2 hour runtime with ease. Out of the 3 games I'm talking about today, Edith Finch has probably the most unremarkable narrative out of the 3. The story is essentially a child reading a book given to him by his dead mother who recounts a whole family line before him and then leaves flowers on her grave. Edith Finch is not about the destination. It's not about a complex plot with twists and turns or characters with depth and well-developed motivations. It's entirely about how this story is told, not the content of the story itself. And at that, it is unbelievably successful. I honestly don't know if I've ever seen a better told story in a video game than this one. It understands the medium and how to use it so thoroughly that I think we'll be looking back on this game in the future and realize just how far ahead of its time it truly is. On paper, a 2-hour game where all you do is walk around a house is the literal eye-rolling description of a walking simulator, but this game says more in 2 hours with only a house as its setting than most full-price games at 3 to 4 times the length. That's what a good walking simulator does in a nutshell. Do more with less. Stand in contrast to the bloated 30 to 40 hour massive open world AAA games that don't have a single consistent thought or intention. The simple experience of exploration is one rife with possibilities and angles for interesting storytelling. Whether it's note-collecting detective work, interactive radio conversations, navigating with a map and a compass, or experiencing the life of those no longer with us, there is a goldmine of untapped storytelling potential that AAA games are too scared to experiment with. Walking simulator may be a sarcastic, derogatory term, but these games are the true tricorn hat-wearing pioneers, embracing brave new ideas and more focused storytelling over their much more respected, larger peers. I'm optimistic that the value of walking will one day be worth its weight in gold.